All right, everybody. Last time we talked about stream erosion, glacial erosion, V-shaped valleys, U-shaped valleys, and so on. And hopefully you had a chance to look at that video with all the pictures of different glacial features. I want to finish up with glaciers in the notes today and show you more pictures of some other glacial features that we didn't get to talk about last time. Many of the features we looked at had to do with valley glaciers or alpine glaciers. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about continental glaciers, and then we'll look at more glacial features. Again, continental glaciers over large areas of land. This is due to colder climates. So we're not talking about elevation, we're not talking about mountains, we're talking about vast expanses of ice or ice sheets. This is a function of latitude and also climate. When we studied climate several weeks ago, we talked about how climate has changed over the course of thousands of years, or even since the beginning of time, really, and how we've gone through different ice ages. That's something we'll talk about more when we do Earth history. This picture here is showing the extent of one of the last ice ages and how glacial ice really migrated south all the way down to where we are. Our area is kind of the southern range of the last ice age. And in one of the other videos I mentioned, Long Island is actually a big terminal moraine. Based on glacial evidence, things like glacial striations and chatter marks and some of the other things that we've talked about, we find evidence of at least 4 major ice ages in the last 2 million years. This is significant for a few reasons. 2 million years really marks the time that we believe the human species has been on planet Earth. 2 million years might sound like a long time, but out of the 4.5 billion years that the Earth has been estimated to be around for, 2 million really isn't that much. And if we look at the past 2 million years, it's only really roughly the past 10,000 or so we have civilization. We have people, farming, agriculture, society, language, writing, culture, past 10,000 years. Before 10,000 years, we're basically talking about humans, Neanderthals, and other hominid species, other types of people, human species. But we're basically talking about individuals, hunting, gathering. We're not really talking about civilization or societies. Anyway, during this time of human species, we believe there were 4 major ice ages. And I mentioned this when we did climate. The time between ice ages is called interglacial. Right now, we live in an interglacial period. It's relatively warm. It's mild. It's comfortable. During an ice age, this area would have been under 1 to 2 miles of ice. Our most recent ice age, we believe, ended around 11,000 years ago. Now, if we look at these past 4 ice ages and where they are on a map, the extent of glaciation or ice was different for different ice ages. And if we take a look at the map, there are some lines on here, and here we could see some different areas where the ice had made it down to. So for example, number 1, the solid black line, was referred to as the Wisconsin Ice Age. And everywhere above the black line would be ice covered. Everywhere south of the black line would be free of ice. We have the dashed line being the Illinoisan. And if we look at this dashed line and find that there, this would show the extent of ice during the Illinoisan Ice Age. The finer dotted line would be the Kansan Ice Age. And then we have the Nebraskan Ice Age. And this is really showing the extent of the glaciation during these last 4 ice ages. Now if we look at the extent of glaciation in New York, well, here's a map of the state. The shaded area would be ice. The only little bit that's not covered in ice is this little bit, Long Island. And again, Long Island is a terminal moraine. This was the extent of the glacier. So the glacier came down as the climate cooled and stopped right where Long Island is, and the glacier created Long Island by basically bulldozing sediment further south. Again, we talked about this idea of transported versus residual soil. Where we live, it's all transported by glaciers, and the soil that we have came from Canada and points further north, and is unsorted soil. If you dig a hole in your backyard, you're going to largely find a mixture of sediments. You're going to find gravel mixed with silt, sand. You're probably going to find a lot of big rocks. It's very hard to dig a hole, even for a fence post around here, because you're going to hit a lot of rocks, again, because of that unsorted sediment. If you lived, further south or in the Midwest, much easier to dig. You could dig a hole without much trouble. Here, hard to dig holes. We have a lot of rocks. You might hit a boulder even that you can't get out, and might have to just dig your hole in a different place than you intended to. All right, anyway, so the point is Long Island, terminal moraine, and we can see that just this little sliver we call Long Island was not under ice. Everywhere else was. Now, this diagram here is a drawing showing glacial features, and again, we can see a lot of fine print here and everything. I think I'm just going to show you some pictures to basically cover this. So let's move on. Now, the next couple of slides have to do with Niagara Falls, and we'll deal with those separately in a couple of minutes. Now, let's skip ahead to page 28, and we'll revisit Niagara Falls later. When we look at the last 4 ice ages, what we find is that, well, the Great Lakes are glacial. The Great Lakes were carved out by glaciers. They were carved by glaciers. And we could label the Great Lakes. We have, Superior here, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. But the point is that as these glaciers moved from the north to the south, they basically clawed out huge valleys, big U-shaped valleys. Again, glaciers carve out U-shaped valleys. And when that ice melted, the valleys filled with water, forming the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes are actually quite deep for this reason. Lake Superior is 1,333 feet deep. That's very, very deep, right? So the Great Lakes are actually fairly deep. They've been carved out by glaciers, U-shaped valleys, due to erosion by glaciers. We also see the Finger Lakes in New York State. Here we have our Finger Lakes here. These are carved by glaciers. And if we look at the orientation of the Finger Lakes, they're largely north-south orientation because that glacial ice was moving south and carved out those glaciers and created what we call the Finger Lakes. Same concept as the Great Lakes. The glaciers carved out those big, again, U-shaped valleys, and then when the ice melted, those U-shaped valleys were filled with water. And here are all of the Finger Lakes, if you've ever been out to that part of the state. But we have these big U-shaped valleys filled with water from the melted ice. And we have, again, a north-south orientation to those lakes because they were carved by the glaciers. Now, let's take a look at some pictures. Now, the first picture that I want to show you is one that's similar to this diagram that's in the notes. But let's take a look at a color image, and then we'll look at actual photographs, because I think that that's really helpful. And actually, I think I'll do that in a separate video. So I'm going to stop here, and then we'll look at these glacial features in a separate video.